Um, President Karen Marie Yost has put the meeting agenda in the chat in case you want to reference it. Um, what we're going to begin with this evening is our Wornom Innovation Grant recipient for this year, Natalie Hill. She is on the call with us and she is going to present. We also have, I see that he just joined, our former Harper Wornom Committee Chair, Montague Williams, is also on the call, and I know he is also going to be part of Natalie's presentation. So, without further ado, I welcome you all, and I will turn it over to Montague and Natalie.
Can you all hear me okay? Oh, there we go.
Yes.
Okay. I just want to make sure I see Natalie here. Oh, there she is. Okay. Great. Hi. Yes, I want to thank everyone for being here. I apologize for coming in a little late. I was getting that spinny wheel for about 2 minutes, and but it all worked out. I'm thankful. I'm excited about our presentation today. For those of you who were a part of the REA gathering earlier this year, you are aware that Reverend Natalie Hill received the Wornom Grant. And her focus is one that I think is very important, especially for me, as I had that spinning wheel for so long. She helps us engage Christian formation with the realities of a digital context, and she helps us understand what it means to engage in ministry and formation in the amidst digital realities. Her presentation at REA was short, just like everyone else's presentation at REA, but as the recipient of the award, she's given a great deal of time, about an hour, to walk us through her project. So she will speak for a bit. It sounds to me like she has some helpful ways of letting people engage, even in the midst of the presentation. When she's done, I will ask her a couple questions and then open it up for a bit of Q&A as long as it fits within our hour-long time frame. So I will turn it over to Reverend Natalie Hill. Thank you.
It's a pleasure to be here with all of you today. I'm a doctoral student at Boston College and studying how we can use digital technology most effectively for faith formation. And I'm going to share my screen here. And so my agenda for this time that I have as part of this fall gathering is to give a little bit of background context, some theory, and to look at digital approaches to faith formation using a case analysis. I'm going to then invite you to split up into breakout groups to look at, so that we can look together at several different current digital models that are being rolled out for faith formation via virtual reality and digital gaming, and then to come back together to share what our collective insights are about what the state of the art or the state of the situation is right now, and where we as people who are theologically educated and religious educators would like to see this go, since a lot of the current existing programs in this area are designed by more computer programming folks rather than those of us in theology and church life and religious life. So that's kind of where I see this going, and I would love your feedback so that at the end, as for directions that would be fruitful for this to go in the future, for my work to go in the future. So the gospel has been called the greatest story ever told. There was a movie by that name. There's been books by that name since then. And storytelling has been a part of faith formation and religious education for millennia. Much of what we recognize as scripture today was first an oral tradition, stories told at firesides from one generation to the next. In the Christian tradition, the Gospels show us how Jesus taught using stories or parables that drew on the lived experience of his listeners to communicate deep messages of faith. More recently, scholars like Tom Groom and Anne Streety Wimberly have demonstrated that story is still central to religious education. While the methods, contexts, and populations differ, both Groom's shared Christian praxis and Streety Wimberly's story linking approaches emphasize the pedagogical importance of God's story and vision, our own individual and communal stories, and the stories of other people of faith, especially exemplars or role models for our ongoing processes of maturing in faith. Finding ourselves reflected in the grand narrative of God's story is what has kept the Bible relevant for thousands of years. Even so, people of faith have continuously looked for ways of telling God's story so that successive generations can connect with their own circumstances and questions. In the Middle Ages, increasingly elaborate plays and pageants portrayed biblical narratives, not only in the vernacular, but also in the culture of the day, sometimes complete with bawdy jokes or invented backstories for minor characters like Noah's wife, who became foils for the central figures. Mary D. Anderson has even demonstrated that some of the carvings and other art in medieval British cathedrals were based on these pageants rather than the biblical text. It's clear that culturally informed and shaped versions of the story stick very deeply in people's souls. While the Reformation shifted away from representational art, reformers wrote hymns to the tunes of popular songs in order to make words more memorable. Fast forwarding to more recent times, we have books for all ages that tell biblical stories engagingly and sometimes with the addition of non-biblical characters to make the story relatable or help people hear it in new ways. Then, of course, television programs like The Veggie Tales, and in today's streaming era, YouTube channels like The Bible Project use videos to tell God's story for contemporary generations. But my question is this the best way to bring this story to life for today's generations? We know from John Dewey a century ago and from all the research on active learning in between that people learn and are formed most by experiences. TV and even reading are pretty passive activities. And yet, digital technology opens up the possibility for more interactive modes of engaging a story. We also know that a growing number of people identify as non-religious or disaffiliated, the so-called nuns and duns. That means more people are growing up without a faith tradition, and others who are raised in a tradition leave that tradition when they're old enough. That has a few implications for us to consider as religious educators. First, there's room for improvement when it comes to telling God's story in ways that are compelling and relevant for today. And second, there's also a need for storytelling that leads people to faith, not just deeper in faith. That includes youth who are attending only for their families and people who may only encounter faith through friends or social media. In other words, what my tradition calls evangelism is becoming a more important consideration within religious education as religion is seen as more culturally passé. Third, white Christian nationalism has been on the rise, in part because it has done a good job of offering people a compelling narrative and a role in that narrative. The most recent Pew data finally showed an uptick in the number of young adults identifying as Christian. However, political scientists cautioned that the entanglement between conservative US politics and conservative Christianity could skew those numbers because identifying as Christian has become a matter of conservative political identity. In other words, it involves being part of what has become a cohesive narrative. It's just a narrative that conflates a story rooted it's a narrative that conflates a story of being rooted in love with one that involves being rooted in hate. And that's problematic for us as religious educators. And finally, technology has become increasingly vivid, multisensory, and immersive. Younger generations have gotten used to a much different form of storytelling than what we might have grown up with, one in which they have an active part, where their actions and choices and skills matter, one that often requires collaborating with others. And social psychology has long demonstrated that working with others toward a common goal builds a sense of community, even when people previously perceived themselves as part of different or even adversarial groups. Consequently, it's no surprise that digital generations are spending increasing amounts of time playing video games. Given all of this background, I believe that we cannot afford to overlook the potential of digital technology, especially immersive technology, such as games where the player actively enters the narrative, and virtual reality, where the emphasis is less on an evolving storyline and more on having this sensory experience of being in a different place or time, sometimes accompanied by other people, as in virtual reality-based worship or religious education. There are already people working on religious applications of these technologies, but there are often people with faith and computer skills, but not always theological education. In the Christian gaming and VR world, creators are also disproportionately from conservative evangelical traditions because those traditions emphasize finding new ways to reach people. My research priority is developing theologically and pedagogically robust uses of digital technology. But without substantial existing research on the subject, a useful starting point is to examine existing, potentially formative digital media. I'll provide a little background on different styles and formats relevant to considering these media. And then I want to look at some questions about these media and how they can be, that those questions can apply to real life examples. So in case you're not a gamer, a few key gaming concepts. First person, third person, top down are words used in the gaming world that mean totally different things than we think of them in academic circles. A first-person narrative, a first-person game, basically means that you are looking out of the eyes of the character that you're playing. You cannot see your own body. You see the world as if you're looking from those eyes. A third-person game is where you see the character that you're playing and all the other characters as if you're looking from the outside. Top down simply means you're looking at all of the players from a third person perspective, but from the top. So if you ever played some of the old games like Zelda and Mario Brothers, often you were looking down at a room where the player moved around. You've probably heard the term RPG or MMORPG. That just means a role play game or a massive multiplayer role play game. So where people are playing designated characters, not themselves usually, but a given character. For example, in biblical stories, that in the ones we might consider tonight, that might be Jesus, that might be an apostle, that might be a random person who might encounter Jesus. Games can also be considered things like combat, a first-person shooter. There is actually a Noah's Ark first-person shooter game, which involves Noah, the character you're playing as the first person, shooting pellets of food at the animals on the ark to put them to sleep. Why? I don't know, but it is a first-person shooter that is also biblical. Tower defense is another one where you're kind of defending defending against increasingly difficult attempts to overcome you. Looter games, it's a concerning word, looting, but it just means that you have skills or abilities that you can improve as the game goes on, as you gain additional experience. Open or closed world is probably one of the current important factors that gamers consider. An open world is where you can go anywhere you want. You can wander at will and explore kind of at your whim instead of following a designated script. A closed world means you have to go from point A to point B to point C on the map. If you ever watched Indiana Jones and the plane went across designated stops, that would have been a closed world where you could only go to specific places as opposed to wandering. An NPC is a non-player character. These are often scripted characters that the computer operates that you might interact with as a player, and they can have important roles in biblical stories, for example, where someone might play the role of someone in the biblical narrative who has designated lines. And finally, PvP means player versus player, where you're going up against actual other humans. PvE is person versus environment, where you might join with other players, but you're going up against NPCs or the game or the computer or something else. You might not need to know all of that, but that gives some context for what we'll consider in the next part of the discussion. So as I look at what's out there right now in virtual reality and digital religious computer gaming, here are some questions that come up for me. What kind of experience does it engender? If we think back to John Dewey, is it educative? Is it miseducative? Is it shaping us for growth or away from growth? Is it neither? Is it both? Are there things that work in one direction and things that work in another direction? Second, what's theologically sound and what is theologically concerning or needs more analysis? Not as a bit of a spoiler alert, but if the player plays Jesus, when is that helpful and when is that potentially not helpful? What do we have to consider? Do we know enough about what we have to consider? How historically and biblically accurate is the story, is the context? Is that important to this particular game or story or context, or is it not that big a deal if the temple doesn't quite look right, or similar things like that? And perhaps most importantly, what aspects of faith and spirituality and morality does the game or the experience cultivate? Are there areas of concern about what is being cultivated or what is not being cultivated? All of these questions will probably make more sense as we look at some examples. And so I have one example to kind of go through together, and then I'd like to break us up and look so that people can look at a few different types of examples. Gate 0 is an open world, meaning you can wander wherever, third person, so you're looking at your own character from behind, action adventure RPG that's set in Israel in the year 33. So the year Christ's ministry came to its conclusion. And it has a bit of a strange backstory. the character that you play is Max, a teen from the year 2072, where a dystopian regime has started to rewrite history and erase truth, trying to make itself the capital T truth of all time. And a time travel accident strands Max in ancient Israel, and his grandmother's captured. So to save his grandmother and restore the truth, he has to find and preserve the original biblical records before they are lost forever. So I think Max is not a person of faith in this backstory. And my guess is that the creators are designing this to potentially appeal to a wider audience than people who would normally pick up something that's a religious video game. And yet it is clearly set in a religious context. And so I have a brief video clip. I shaved down some real life gameplay into this 5-minute clip. So I'll share it now. Obviously, the experience is a unique one. I was particularly struck after spending last semester constructing Herod's temple from historical and primary sources myself, about how accurate the temple was for the most part. Especially at the very beginning of this scene, he is standing on the Mount of Olives, and you can see across almost like you're looking into the temple, and that is how it looked. More problematic is the fact that the Ark of the Covenant is still in the temple in this version, when the Ark of the Covenant was never found again after the Babylonian exile and after it was taken captive. So in some respects, it's very accurate to the Bible and historical sources, and in other respects, it's not. Whether and to what extent that matters, I think, is up for theological debate. It doesn't, are people really going to be shaped by whether or not the Ark of the Covenant is there? I'm not sure. But what are the beliefs, the spirituality, the morality that it cultivates? I like the image of, the veil being torn and being able to go to God in search of grace and mercy. On the other hand, if the audience is like Max, people who might not be people of faith right now, how does that translate? I'm not sure right now. The quests that Max goes on, some of them are probably neutral, like in order to get that showbread, he has to go and find flour and salt in the basement of the temple. I cut that part out for the sake of time. Does that matter? Not really. He has to get those priestly robes. There's a whole storyline where the robes change his DNA to make him a Levite so he can become a priest, which stretches credulity a little bit, but does educate people into what it took to be a priest. So, I think that there are areas that it's important for us to think about what matters, what doesn't matter, and what's going to be most formative for people. Is it formative for people to see into the holiest spaces of the temple in that time, or is it more important for them to be making decisions about handling smaller scale questions of faith? And those are some of the things that are going to come up in the examples in our case discussion breakout. So we're going to split into 4 groups. This URL that I will also, and I'll also share it in the chat. There will be 4 games or VR experiences with a description and a link to a video for you to watch. And so if we can take maybe the videos are about 12 minutes. So if we can take about, I know the videos are 4 minutes. Sorry, if we can take about 12 minutes to discuss in small groups and then come back together, have somebody who's willing to kind of share a brief summary of what your content was and what your group thought about it. That would be really great, really helpful for my research and really helpful, I think, for all of us as we consider what digital media look like for religious education. And maybe we can just take it in order. Is someone from group one?
Do we know what group is 1 or 2 or 3? That's my.
Oh, yes. One was the VR of Herod's Temple. Virtual reality, it was not a game.
Okay. That's not my group.
We were group 3. Well, group 1, we had a video of a virtual reality experience of walking through the Temple of Herod, with a narrator talking to us about what we're seeing and where we're going and the different aspects of it, things like this. And the conversation was about, first of all, that like a VR experience where you're wearing the goggles is quite different from having a video of wandering around the place. That the VR experience could be very much more like engaging, but also perhaps harder to argue with.
Mm.
And maybe other folks want to say something from group 1.
I'll just add to that. I mean, John brought it up, and a couple of others did, that it really still wasn't that highly interactive. I mean, it was still more of a passive tourist kind of encounter as opposed to actually co-creating. So that lack of game interaction really was not a part of the experience from that standpoint. Again, we were watching a video, but even the implications were inside the VR environment. You're still getting a pretty highly controlled environment as opposed to actually interacting with it significantly.
I said to the group, I wish if we could bring everyone to BC, I could have handed out VR goggles to at least to 6 people or so at a time. But doing it this way, we're more limited. But it would be, it's different in VR. But this particular video was a one-person user interacting with a non-player character guide. And so there's VR where a bunch of different people can bring their avatars into the same space together. And then there's VR like this, where it is more of it's immersive, but it is passive. So I think those are important observations. Thanks. What about group 2, which was scrolling, that dragon cancer. This was a different kind of game than a standard game. Maybe someone can share about that.
We failed at our project of discussing the video. We did watch the video, and then we were getting to know each other briefly, and then suddenly 12 minutes was gone. But ours was more, even in the description, like more meditative. So it was describing kind of a parent's journey with their 4-year-old son with cancer. So it was much more meant to be, in the description you gave us, it's much more meditative was the word, which I thought was interesting. So we didn't really get to discuss it. I don't know if others in the group have thoughts about what they saw. It's pretty, I thought, I was wondering, just with my pastoral hat on more than my religious education hat, like I could imagine it being really helpful to some people. But also kind of like what group one described, it's very, very passive, right? So it caused me to wonder about the merits of actually having people to interact with rather than just the experience and what that would feel like to someone going through that.
Anyone else from group two want to share something?
I used the actual audio from this family's like home videos, like phone recordings, things like that. And so we got to hear like the father and the son singing songs together, and the father just like asking really powerful questions like, if like, can God love my son like God loved Lazarus? And what does that mean? It's like a really deep, profound questions that like even though it was a passive game, like I found myself really drawn in emotionally to this like real open, vulnerable space where people ask like really important questions about suffering and death, especially of innocence. And so even though it was individual and more passive, I still found it communal and like, if I have these questions, I've had these questions. I'm not alone in that. And so witnessing the vulnerability of this father and through the sounds of their child, I found it to be a passive, but also not passive and deeply engrossing. And I felt not alone in it.
It was probably the most unique game that I came across in that it's called a game, but the ways that you can interact with it are like clicking on objects like the guitar or clicking on the message bottles in the ocean that have messages in them. And some of those messages were actually from people who supported it via the Kickstarter campaign and had lost children and shared their own content. So it was really beautiful, but again, figuring out and it approached faith from a different perspective. It wasn't biblical in the sense that most of these games are, but it was spiritual and it was about formation today. And I think that there's really an important place for that, but figuring out again how to make it conversational, engaging, or have some conversation partner in it, I think could bring it up to the next level. What about group three? Group three was I Am Jesus Christ.
I belong to that group. I think, for context, it's said in the context of the last part of John the Baptizer's role in morphing into Jesus, and then going into the wilderness, and then ending up with the embarrassment of the wedding at Cana, running out of wine. I use embarrassment. It was embarrassing for the couple, and it was also embarrassing for Jesus that he has to be reminded by the mother, you could do this. You don't need to wait any longer. Okay, I'm just describing the context and perhaps the atmospherics. As for the lesson that might confer as the clip, what lessons we use the word educative and non-educative. We saw the problematic there. It could be the clinical accuracy of the narrative was definitely something to notice. On the other hand, because we are talking about a multitude of audiences, we thought we should not lock ourselves into the either or mode, because what appeals to somebody might not appeal to the other, or vice versa. So that was our conversation before our 12 minutes was up. But if I may, even I have thought about this just as the few minutes that I just passed. I wonder what and how one who is familiar with the video game could experience that clip. I am completely innocent of video games, so it's not something that is an offering for me. So how I experience that, might it be different from somebody who is invested in it already? And how attractive is that video game model to older generations or the non-digitized audiences or people who are off the grid, for instance? We're just kind of thinking about it. But in all, I give it pass mark, remembering Howard Gardner's multiple intelligences. I think that's the general. I think is okay.
I think the area where I don't have an answer, I only have questions about the potentially positive and negative ramifications of taking on the person of Jesus. Like, is it more transformative to act as Jesus in the game or to interact with Jesus in a game? I had some problems with some of how they portrayed some of the miracles. There was a lot of like seeing hands do this as if they were sending out power and stuff like that. That was maybe theologically iffy to me, but I think it's an interesting perspective. And I only have a few more minutes, so I do want to get to hear from group 4, which was one of 500. Anyone from group 4 want to share a few words?
I could offer a bit of a summary of some things that I thought I heard going around, but I did think that there were a few folks in the group that had some important things to say, and we actually closed off as someone was speaking. So I wasn't sure if that thought wanted to continue right here.
Go on with the summary, Montague, then we'll see.
Okay. Well, I think overall there were some interest just in general around the idea of trying to analyze the theology of a video game, knowing that there are different theological perspectives. So to talk about something as theologically sound or not comes with a variety of assumptions that need to be spelled out a bit before that analysis begins. There was also some talk around technology not being neutral, and that there are, even if it's not explicit, there are some things at play in the way people create games, what intentions are actually there in the games that are created. There was, sorry, I had a note for myself somewhere here. The game that we had was a game called One of 500, and the idea was you encounter the gospel story in Christian faith around through the lens of a young fisher. And so, you're kind of walking through the world with their questions. I personally was thinking about the role of role playing and just how that now forces you into the questions of this game and the questions that they're encountering along the way. And also, I was thinking personally about just the role of culture and the way culture gets presented as holy, just in the way, if this is a biblical game, you're presented with particular ideas. You're also presented with particular sounds and particular sights and particular looks. And it can, if this is meant to invite you into what is good and right, it's just an interesting thing in and of itself. But I did wonder if there was anyone else in the group that wanted to just build on any of that. I guess not. I didn't.
Well, I'll throw out that, I think in one of my mental iterations of the slides that did not apparently translate to the real version of the slides, the question was more about explicit and implicit theology than like good or bad theology. But thinking about what theologically we want to convey, and and keeping in mind what's implicit and not only what's explicit. One thing I found in all of these, interesting and potentially problematic in all of these games, were the accents chosen for people from the Middle East, and who are speaking in English. But even in the clip that I showed for Gate Zero, the protagonist was speaking with an Australian or New Zealand accent. I'm not precise enough to know, but then everyone from the Middle East was speaking with a very different accent. And it's interesting. Let's put it that way. I'll stop there.
Just to double check, I know that our time in many ways tells us we need to transition to a break. I did have a couple questions that I did want to ask, even if they can't all get answered, but I did just want to check in to find out, first of all, Natalie, did you have a closing that you wanted to offer at this point? Or is this the opening for conversation?
This is a good opening. I was going to move into kind of just summarizing what people observed and moving into a more broad discussion. So I think it's fine to just do that.
Okay. And then I just also wanted to ask Jennifer Moe, is there time remaining for me to ask a couple questions?
Yes, you can. We can extend till about 8:10.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, just when I think about some of the things I heard come up along the way and through your presentation, first of all, thank you. I know that this presentation was a little bit more interactive version of thinking kind of down the line from what you presented at REA, which had more of a historical and theoretical basis of possibility. Here you brought us to video games as a sort of a medium to engage, which very interesting method. Thank you very much for that. One thing that came up in our group was this. Someone said, this basically isn't my thing. I'm interested to know the appeal, though. And it connects with a broader question that I have, which is just around, the rapid nature of technological change and the desire to engage religious education. So much of our interest in this very topic is just around how do you do this with technological changes? Of course, we can say that's always happened, but you have a whole crew of folks in the Religious Education Association who showed up here, and perhaps half would say, yeah, like this is not necessarily my thing. But what your presentation from REA's, annual gathering in this tends to suggest is a lot of life will be engaging the world in this way. Like, even if you're not playing a video game, much of life will be gamified through virtual reality or digital spaces. A lot of the modes of gaming are slowly entering the modes of regular life. And with that in mind, how do we continue the work of scholarship and religious education if so much of it might require a sort of immersion into things that many would say, this is not my thing? Okay. That's one question I have for you. I do have another one, but perhaps you just want to engage that one.
Sure. And yeah, I mean, I think the halls of theology schools and religious education and seminaries are are not the places where we play the most video games. Well, I might, but I think part of why I chose existing media for this is because there is a really steep learning curve to developing this stuff. I've been working on Herod's Temple myself since the spring, and I have it in a VR platform, but currently the players fall through it because it's not considered solid in this particular platform. So it wasn't ready for showcasing today. My vision, well, part of the concern, I think, is, the people who aren't showing up for church are spending an awful lot of time on digital platforms, whether that's video chat, whether that's gaming, whether that's Discord, whether that's virtual reality. And there was recently an article in the New York Times showing like a significant increase over the last 15 years among 14 to 24-year-olds or something like that, in the amount of time they're spending gaming and the extent that that takes away from things like work and school and sleep. So I also have seen an increase in gaming churches online. It's a whole genre of digital churches that are just for like designed for gamers, because they're not leaving the computer. And I'm more interested in how digital technology allowed different experiences of space and time than what we can create in person. I think we're never gonna do what we do in person as well as we do it in person. But there's things we can't do in person, like visit Herod's Temple. And if we can do that in a way that's interactive, that is conversational, that is engaging people in their questions in a deeper way, that we will be able to help new generations, but also those who this is not their natural milieu, to have different kinds of experiences of faith that might help them to grow and continue their formation.
And then my last question for you is this. I think with a lot of religious education options out there and with a growing digital world, one major question we might have as religious educators is how do you turn people to each other, in the real world, to something embodied?
Yeah.
We don't want to get lost in the digitization of life.
Mm-hmm.
So are there ways that this digital engagement of faith formation can point us to each other in embodied ways?
That would be my vision. I've thought a fair amount about digital churches over the years, and more in my tradition. I'm Methodist. In my tradition, that's, you can have a fully digital church that never meets in person, but also I think that's problematic to never go out and interact with real people and to be in service with real people, to touch people physically, like literally and metaphorically. And so I think that people can be formed in different ways digitally that enhance what they're doing in person or in real life. And I think that starting digitally might give people an entry into the in-person communities that then deepen their experience. I think most people now, if they're church shopping or exploring or considering a new community, will check them out online and maybe observe a service that's being live streamed before they go in person. And so I think having the opportunity to feel things out, especially for a generation, our COVID generation, where they spent formative years only on screens, right? Like going in person, cold entering a space is terrifying. I'm a college chaplain, and the real life interactions take some time to build up to. So I think that interacting as an avatar, where you can control how you're perceived in a certain way, can give you a softer starting point for those real life the real life encounters.
Well, thank you very much. I think being a chaplain at MIT is quite a connection to the kind of work you're doing, and I hope that you have found the comments after the groups to be fruitful as you continue your work, and I hope everyone here has found this fruitful for their own wonder, even if it is not your thing. I will turn this over to Jennifer Moe to guide us to the next move.
One last comment. If anyone was curious about somebody else's video, all the videos are linked on that same document, so you can watch the other videos that people looked at. Thanks again.
Thank you, Natalie. I see we're getting a lot of applause on screen for you. This was so interesting. Thank you so much. And thank you to Montague for giving a couple of questions for Natalie to consider with us tonight. We're going to take a short break. Let's come back it is now I'm in Central Time. It is 8:12 Eastern Time, which is kind of our standard that we go by. Let's come back at 8:20. So just under a 10-minute break for people to get up and move their bodies around and maybe turn off their cameras and eat a snack or whatever you'd like to do. And we'll see you back here at 8:20 p.m. Hello, everyone, and welcome back. I have turned the recording back on, and I am now going to invite our president, Karen Marie Yost, to guide us through the second half of the evening. You'll see that in the chat, she has put some potential questions to explore during our conversation tonight. And without further ado, welcome, Karen Marie.
Thank you, Jen. So I really do see a sort of connection between what Natalie invited us to do in terms of thinking about some of the educative or miseducative aspects of virtual reality or gaming experiences and questions about theological soundness or theologically concerning, that sort of stuff, that in many ways this next portion of our evening is broadening that question out, moving it beyond the question of digital culture into just generally in culture, so that we might think about what's the role of religious education in helping people navigate information and disinformation, particularly when it regards ethical issues and decision making that we're called upon to make in small and large ways, day in and day out. So I have dropped some questions in. I label them potential questions to explore because they're just suggestions. And there's no particular order in which we might engage them, but you may have a more pressing question related to this theme that you want to put on the table. And I invite you to do that if one of these questions isn't a springboard that you find helpful. So I'm just I'll note them because not everybody's in a format where they can read the questions easily in chat. So potential questions to explore include: what kind of information do contemporary people need to make good ethical decisions? How is disinformation influencing people's understandings of religious and ethical ideals? How do shifting ideas of authoritative sources reframe ethical debates in helpful and in problematic ways? And what kinds of responses can religious educators make to address disinformation? Again, suggestive, but I'm just going to open the floor and invite folk to speak. If we've got a number of folks, if you'll use the hand raising emoji just to kind of keep us moving somewhat in order so that I'm not trying to find everybody on the screen and keep track exactly of who was ready when. I open the floor and invite your thoughts.
I believe the responses to these questions, we are not going to follow any particular order, right? And I am drawn to the questions broadly make important the need for history, in the place of history in theology. And when I say history, I'm looking at the historical method as issues of today being predicated on the past that influenced their the status quo, and how we need to take our responses to the status quo into consideration, or into but bearing in mind, of course, that the Jesus story is about resistance to the status quo. And so whatever we are presented today, which have been baked from the past, we must, in whatever posture we take, it must be a situation where we are either resisting the status quo or reclaiming the original intent of Jesus, or the original intent of the Jesus movement. For instance, I am appalled by the fact that most people would tend to consider Jesus as this docile, effeminate, pacifist, and non-violent, or would I say, the kind of character. We forget that Jesus was a rebel, who will disrupt the status quo at any moment he has a chance, and because he's asking more questions, he's trying to broaden the horizons of understanding, and so challenges what were the accepted norms of those who were in power at his time, and the need for us to do the same today. So for any measure of Christian realism, it must be continuing that very kind of project, because we never have a perfect society, and so we need to have Jesus-minded people who are challenging whatever practices we have today.
Thank you. Is there anyone who'd like to build on or sort of query that those comments?
So I'm going to take a risk here. I'm not on the front line of educating anybody anymore, but I work more theoretically in the politics of religious literacy. And so one of the things that my friend who just spoke in this gathering is the context is the Christian faith and the Christian tradition. And I'm wondering, so I think more, I step back from that. I'm also a Christian, so that's my tradition as well. But I've thought about, so what we're really talking about is a form of religious literacy. But I'm just wondering if we've considered the issue of context, like in what context is literacy defined, and then who defines it? So I think about the politics and the power issues involved, of how stories are told and which stories are told. So I came out of after I retired, I did a PhD at the University of Ottawa, and most of my colleagues there were talking about religious literacy. but they were talking about it in a very different way. So they were taking a social sciences approach. And for them, religious literacy was really around the civic virtues of tolerance and respect for diversity. And I argued that the literacy meant for them taking religious less seriously. So I'm wondering if we've considered the issue of context and what this would sound like to my Muslim friends, for example. What does literacy look like to them, or what does it mean to, so I'm just putting that out there because I'm thinking of context as an important issue around the issue of literacy.
Thank you. Israel, I saw your hand earlier. Do you want to speak to some of what Leo had to say, or do you want to hold a minute to see if there are others that are directly on point?
I could wait. I was going to follow up on Father's point that he was mentioning about the historical critical method, but happy to let someone chime in and follow up on Leo's point.
Is there anybody who wants to comment specifically on the issue of context? If not, we will move to Israel, who wants to continue the other line. All right, we'll come around, but Israel, go ahead.
All right, so I guess you can sort of bring context into this also. As I was preparing for a presentation this summer, I was reading Alan Figueroa Deck's work. And one of the things that he mentions is that ideology is an enemy of pastoral practice, right? And I think as I'm hearing Father and the importance of historical critical method, well, as a way to try to keep Jesus from falling into ideological frameworks, right? How are we able to speak about Jesus in ways that remains faithful to what's in the gospel? And with that, I recall Richard Gallardi came once to Barry University to present, and he was presenting on this idea of critical belonging, right? How do we form people to have a sense of critical consciousness in the church? And I think that's as much as content, I think it's important to form people in how to be critical thinkers, right? How to have a sense of conscientization so that our pedagogies or activities or assessments, right, are forming and shaping people in that way. Because there will be, and as you know, back to Natalie's point and earlier, with so much media out there and so many different stories there, part of the challenge is how do they discern between the many voices, right? How do they discern through this cacophony? Um, and I think this idea of critical belonging and conscientization, and I think it comes back to context because how do I do that in my space, right? How am I aware of what's happening within me and how can I be engaging faith to transform that space?
Thank you. So I've dropped in the chat kind of a summary of what we heard, and I think I would add on Israel's comment that the transformation of space is also a consideration. Cheryl, I see your hand.
Thank you, Karen Marie, and thank you, Natalie. A couple of things both related to both of the comments that were just made. I'm quite preoccupied these days with the formation of people who would identify as nones, Nones, who may not be formed in the religious traditions that are the prominent ones among our guild, but who are being formed in a cultural context without those supports, we would call them, or cultural pillars, we might call them, and who are still very interested in making what they would call good decisions or sound decisions. And I come back to the ancient Greeks who were very preoccupied with forming good citizens. And if you read Michel Foucault's second volume in his History of Christianity, he talks about how the Greeks were preoccupied with what were the values that formed good citizens. And so if we looked at what Natalie's talking with us tonight in that lens, if we're looking at 21st century, 22nd century, 23rd century people who will be living here long after we have gone, what will they use to form themselves into people who make good decisions? So I think about some of my relatives, youngsters just starting university, who are not familiar with the Bible at all as I would be, or the Torah as others would be, or the Quran as some would be. How do they make their decisions, and how do they become people with integrity as their selves would value? So I'll broaden it to that and think this issue is so important. Do we want to reach this question or have this question reach people outside of our cultures? And are we interested in a broader global conscience formed by our dominant religions? And do we also think that God, as we know God, will meet them in whatever way is possible? And then I'll go back and I'll stop with this. I'll go back to the first question in our annual meeting, the competition about what was technology, what were the or the most revolutionary technological movements in history, and who won? The printing press. The printing press and the internet. So now, would someone who held the first King James version of the Bible say, I can't relate to this? I'm not used to meeting God in print. Where would God meet me with this new discovery? How am I supposed to become a better person and to live in my culture with this? Thank you, Natalie.
Thank you, Cheryl. Russ.
Yes, thank you, Cheryl and Natalie. Pierre Baban's name was mentioned in the first half of our time, and I know I used to teach, again, in a previous millennium, the new era in religious communication, and talking about all of these eras and how we communicated and how we have access to oral, print, as well as digital media. Yes, I think we do have a culture that no longer has foundational myths. How can we have these conversations Alasdair MacIntyre talks about of our virtue with other communities of faith when those are eroding? I used to be, and I still am, a strong promoter of religious literacy and of media literacy because the Christian church did do a good job with print, right? The first book on movable type, the Bible, the Wesleys printing out their flyers and their hymnals. And even for all of its faults, the Sunday School Union didn't just teach people to read in Britain, it taught them to read critically because they were afraid now that things were being published out there. And so even teaching the children of, who could not go to private schools, I still believe that's all very important. Here in America, I think we just have this problem. I'm overwhelmed by this. I teach a course, I'm teaching a course in the spring, preparing to do justice, religious education towards advocacy and action. And I used to just jump to it. How do you prepare people to take part in protests, etc.? And this year, I'm having them read at the beginning Howard Thurman's Jesus and the Disinherited, that there needs to be this spiritual foundation for them to pass on to their communities of faith. This sense of understanding, because the question is, when we talk about this, how do we help people make ethical decision making? We almost have to step back. Is there such thing as ethical decision making? Disinformation? Well, what is truth? Are we interested in really how many people are interested in seeking out facts and information so that they can get rid of, through media literacy, dispense with disinformation, but make sound ethical decisions based on that? Or is it embracing the beliefs of their tribe, which is a problematic term? I know it's one that's out there in the culture.
Usman.
Well, thank you very much, Russell, for these thoughts, and Karen Marie for the questions that you have offered. As I was looking at the questions, somehow they take me a little bit by surprise, because I read these questions, somehow, or I'm trying to read behind these questions and feel that sometimes we as religious educators are somehow longing for a time when there's a moment when we actually could make ethical decisions that apply to everybody and that everybody embraced, but let's be honest, there has never been such a time, so this is something that, for instance, having been and done some work in Latin America, that was one of the first experiences that the Catholic Church, encountered when meeting tribal communities or indigenous communities. They just realized that they had their own codes of ethics and that they have their own ways of being. They had their own ways of understanding reality and making meaning and so on. But so is the reality in the United States of America. I live in New England, and all I have to do is travel to the South, and then realize that there's a different ethical code there, and somehow you find a different ethical code in the West of the country, and we can go on and on and on in different continents and so on. So I think that what's been happening, right now, and thanks to technology, to the internet, to digital media these days, is that we have become more aware of the dissonances, that exist in our world and in our different environments, and even within our own denominations. And the way I see this is a fragmentation that should not surprise us, but as a fragmentation that, as a matter of fact, I see more relevant and more evident, to all of us. And I feel that, as religious educators, there are two things that we need to do. On the one hand, each of these fragmented communities need religious educators, in their own way, to help them navigate, their own codes of ethics, their own ways of interpreting their sacred texts, their own practices. And then we need religious educators that are able to build bridges across the different communities, and that's the only way in which I see any future for a field that actually exists in the context of fragmented communities. Thank you for this conversation.
Thank you. I see John.
I appreciate all the different conversations that are going on around these topics. Thank you for bringing them up, Karen Marie. It struck me what Cheryl was saying when she mentioned Foucault. I do not think that I am a person who thinks only in terms of raw power. But once I figure out what seems to be right to me, I'm very interested in using the rhetorical power of religious texts to put, strong arguments out there against the rhetorical power of demonic approaches. So, like, what I think about as a religious educator is, how can I reach folks who are in religious traditions, whether they're Christian or Jewish, Muslim, whatever they are, or who are still have some residual feeling for the religious tradition, even if they're nuns, maybe they still have a sense of like, oh, did Jesus actually say that? That's quite interesting. That's the stuff that I want to put out there to counteract the dangerous stuff that's out there.
Thanks, John. I've been trying to note points that are being made in the chat, just to help you be able to track and go back. And I hope that you'll add in material yourselves if you're so inclined, but just to help us with a conversational forum. Israel.
I have a sort of question I want to just put out there. because as we're talking about misinformation and it was just sort of mentioned, the question of truth comes out. And just to sort of phrase, my undergraduate work was in social studies education in a global awareness multicultural education program at Florida International University, where at the time, in trying to be global, they were not really very focused in having some kind of boundaries of what truth was. Everything was sort of relative, right? Years later, when I went back to school to visit and do some interviews as what they had updated, they had mentioned that had brought them a problem because they could not make any judgment on anything that was evil. And so eventually they began to start looking at the Declaration of Human Rights of the United Nations as a way to somehow ground some argument or way to make judgment. So it seems to me is how can we engage in speaking about truth within plurality, right? To what extent is this idea of Moses as the proto-prophet of Torah that sort of creates a fence, but with Torah can be interpreted, right? Can there be such a thing? So that we can have some kind of grounding and yet allow for the multiple voices to somehow shine.
Thanks, Israel. Marcy.
Thanks. One of the things that's striking me about this conversation and part of what's in the chat as well is the strange juxtaposition between this sense of a loss of a foundational myth versus our importance on historical accuracy. And is it myth that we're trying to return to, or is it historical accuracy that we're trying to return to? And is returning to either of those actually what is needed when we're talking about ethical decision making? I mean, it's an interesting idea to sort of get back to what are our central stories. And that's always contextual, and that's always who is defining those central stories. But also even in terms of historical accuracy, you know, whose story is getting told in that, whose history, by whose lens, and what do we have to work with, and what do we have to access, and that's not without a critical perspective. The thing that I think is difficult is that when I really appreciated, oh, I'm not sure that he's still here. The first comment, talking about sort of Jesus as being against the status quo and the importance of lifting that up, which as a political philosophy or political theology, I appreciate. But I think one of the things that we're wrestling with at this point is that the perception that the status quo is diversity, inclusion, and equity, or the status quo is critical race theory, and that those things, the way that they are being framed in order to discredit them, is that they're not historically accurate, or that they aren't truth. And so I think in order to approach this as religious educators, we need to think about what does it mean to work with in the importance of accuracy or the importance of story, and what are the stories and accuracies or histories that we're working with, and how do we help people engage in those critically, that don't pit one against the other necessarily.
Thank you, Marcy. Montague, I saw your hand before. Did you want to jump in?
No, I actually lowered it with intention.
Okay. Michael?
Yeah, this is really great conversation, and I just wanted to, build off of what Marcy was just saying. when we're talking about myths, I think that opens us up as well to think about religious education beyond just cognitive dimensions. And so when we think about religious education, and misinformation, disinformation, I think we tend to think about these things in terms of cognitive rationality. But when we turn to affect and those emotional formations, I think that's the emotional literacy and affective literacy can be really powerful and important. One of my colleagues, had a little Substack piece about debate and how she declined to debate someone because she realized it was just an affective performance where people on either side just get to cheer on their person and be more formed and consolidated in their affective identity and thus their belonging and becoming that group. And so I think, as religious educators, we have to keep that in mind too, that the person, the human person, is more than just the cognition, and that's shaped by myths, stories, narratives, and all of these things that are coming up.
Thank you. Again, there are some things popping into the chat as well, a few comments, as well as my sort of string following our conversation. Are there those who haven't had an opportunity to speak this evening who'd like to comment on what they've heard? Or Dean, I see you.
Yeah, I'll just briefly, that question of maybe just from where I'm located now, within my context, this language of information to make an ethical decision, as opposed to a kind of affective forming people into moral virtue, has really been a shift in our own context right now. And this is leading into moral psychology and kind of the way in which we do respond more emotionally. Emotion isn't a weighted word, but we tend to respond affectively first, and then ratio cognition follows. And so we've been spending more time around the virtues, and particularly the virtue of care, as a way of trying to build posture within our own students, so that however they deal with difference, and however they feel like they want to defend truth, there is an underlying sort of posture that guides them. So that's all I have to say for today. I mean, it's just been a project that we've been involved in on a pretty regular basis now.
Yeah. Thanks, Dean. Eileen and then Heather.
Hi. This is not well formed yet, but it's pulling from a bunch of what's been said, both by Natalie and others here. I think that when we look at the tradition from our various generations here represented, we, I don't know, make assumptions feels too strong, but we understand groups of disciples as a community kind of moving, doing something in concert. And it came up in the demonstrations that Natalie was having us do, that there's a real reluctance to be in-person human community. And are we taking that into account when we teach about what it means to be a community of followers of Christ or Allah or God, whatever? I don't think I said that well, but hopefully some of it came across.
Thanks, Eileen. Heather.
Yeah, thank you. My context is always looking at religious education, particularly for children. And I think we have seen throughout history that religious education, religion has can be a powerful tool of control if it's used in that way. And I think often of, particularly in the US and our sort of the schooling paradigm that has shaped much of the religious education that children are engaged with, that in my mind is almost forming them in a way of engaging with religion and questions of ethics and morality that says someone else is going to tell you what to believe or how to feel or what to value, because it comes from the Sunday school teacher, the pastor. And I think so much of I appreciate the conversation about foundational myths, and how we bring those, what are those myths, but also I think maybe the co-creation of making meaning from those myths and how does one engage with those and how are we kind of forming young people not only to engage, like to hear and to be given content, but how are we forming them in ways to make meaningful co-creation of some of these myths and texts and whatnot.
Thanks, Heather. Natalie.
I'm listening to all this through my lens as a college chaplain at MIT in a very international and science focused place where mentioning religion automatically brings skepticism from undergrads because they still think that religion and science can't coexist. From graduate students more because of disinformation and because of the ways that religion has been weaponized for political purposes. And I've been a chaplain there since 2018, and I've tried a whole bunch of different things to try to build a ministry in that setting. And what eventually became meaningful is doing, not talking, I'm Christian, but not talking about Jesus, but doing what Jesus would do. So I host a dinner every Monday, and there's no strings attached. They don't have to listen to me speak. They can have as much food as they want. And I get about 80 students, and all I do is love them. And that is the only thing that I've found to be a powerful way to do religious formation with this generation. Because if I talk first, I have no credibility. If I do, then sometimes they ask me why I do it. And then I can share what my values are. But it's really hard to go up against the stereotypes of faith that have been formed right now. But doing it, I think, is the most promising, I guess, angle that I can find.
Dave?
Yes, this actually connects a bit to what I was thinking about earlier. And it connects with an assignment I offer in one of my courses where I have students interview people who would identify as either none or done. Obviously, people don't often call themselves that, but how they describe themselves would fit into those categories. And one interesting finding from the interviews is that many people would tell the students somewhere in the midst of the interviews, they would say something like, I don't really get to talk about these things, and I'm actually surprised you care. And it has really struck me that we do lack a practice of listening, and that listening in itself can or might be a pathway to a kind of religious education that we sometimes have this strange longing for. Hossman said earlier, there never was this sort of like universal thing that everybody was attached to. But there might be some practices that connect well with human beings that also connect dots across different traditions and connect with human longing, not necessarily to get them into a particular religious experience, but to connect the dots across religious experience to tap into what it means to be human together. And I just found that listening might be a pathway there. And we don't really teach that often as a practice, you know? So I've just been really wondering about that.
Thank you. We have time for maybe one more comment because we're at 8:58 Eastern Time. Who has not had an opportunity to speak tonight who might want to comment on this conversation? Hearing no other comments, we'll let Montague's comment stand as the last on our conversation for now. And as we're wrapping up, I just want to remind you of two things. One, that we have for those who are going to Boston for the American Academy of Religion Society of Biblical Literature meeting, there is an REA at AAR gathering on Monday, November 24th. From 11 to 12:30 Boston time, talking about pursuing freedom through religious education in a digitalized world. So akin to the conversations we've been having tonight or whatever time it is where you are. And you can find more information about that, including the location in the hotels on the REA website. And then we also have now gone live with our REA annual meeting website. I'm putting that link in the chat now. The call for proposals is up. The form, I believe, for being able to submit your proposal is up. And if you haven't already heard, it is an open call. Global Landscapes and Horizons of Religious Education. We are the Religious Education Association. The work we do is the field of religious education. And so this is a meeting for exploring that. So please take a look at that call for proposals and share the work that animates your thinking, reflection, practice with your colleagues. And so you'll see all of that information there. And that brings us to 9 p.m. So I'm going to turn things back over to Jen for any concluding remarks or information that needs to go out before we call it done.
Thank you, Karen Marie, and thank you to everyone who presented this evening and who asked incredible questions and brought up wonderful things for us all to think about. I don't have any more announcements, honestly. Karen Marie has deftly handled all of the things that are coming up for us. And so I just thank you all for coming. And of course, head to our website, always there for you to find out information about the REA. And hopefully we'll see you again soon.
Right. And Jen, when will we see the recording? And where can people find that later?
Oh, yes. Thank you for asking that. The recording will go up on the website. I think there is a page called Fall Gatherings, if I'm correct. And that will likely be up in, I would say, a couple of weeks, probably. I will be letting our networking coordinator know as soon as this meeting is over.
Right. Good day, good afternoon, good night, all.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Jen. Will you also post the comments since they were so good?
I've saved the chat, and Jen could do as well, but I did save it because I want them to. So we have